Welcome to Wide Angle, and wishing all our viewers a very happy 2018. At the start of the year, one of the conversations we're going to have is with Professor Rahul Sagar, who's with the New York University based in Abu Dhabi, who is a political scientist and researches what he calls moral puzzles in contemporary politics. But more interesting to us at this juncture in India's political discourse, as we constantly debate the ideas or the notions of patriotism versus nationalism, Professor Sagar has spent the last 7 years going over 220,000 documents that perhaps give us an insight into what nationalism is for India, what Hindu nationalism is. So let's talk about this further with him without much ado. Rahul Sagar, thanks very much for being on Wide Angle. To start off, 220,000 documents that you've looked at. Tell us a little bit about this research that you've done, why you decided to go into what Hindu nationalism is, and how do you place your findings in today's political context?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for having me. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I realized that there was a serious lack of investigation or research into Indian intellectual history, where we come from, where do our ideas come from, how do we conceive of our place in the world. And I began to look at the archives, and I was doing what most other scholars were doing, which is trying to look for letters and memos and things of that kind. And what I realized was that there was a vast literature that Indians had written about, that these documents had either been lost or they were scattered around the world in libraries, and they were hard to piece together. And these were essays that Indian intellectuals, the most important Indian intellectuals of the 19th and early 20th century, wrote in journals, a bit like, you know, our prominent things like Seminar or the major, you know, New York Review of Books or Spectator, Guardian, things of those kinds. So people wrote in these journals and shared them across the country. They were in English, so they allowed people across different regions to talk about their ideas. You know, there was a culture of being involved in public life, and so you wrote these. You didn't write books, which took forever, and you didn't write just short op-eds as we do now, but these were longer essays. And so as I realized how important these documents were and how much they told us and informed us about how Indians think about the most important democracy, women's the place of women in public life, education, the economy, Swadeshi, all these kinds of things, I began to raise some money to try and recover these documents. And so I raised somewhere in the region of about $700,000, employed 180 research assistants, and sent them to about 40 different libraries across the world to collect these documents. And now I'm planning to put them all online for people to be able to examine and look at these, and hopefully to spur work. And so one of the things that's come out of this massive exercise is a whole set of documents that were either lost or scattered before or unknown, that give us an insight into how we started to think about some of these topics that rile us even today.
Right.
What's the Indian nation? How do we think about Hinduism? What's the place? How do different communities live together, etc.
So to talk about this further, you say that Hindu nationalism is both triumphant and dominant, and yet at the same time it needs to look inwards and reassess where it is, where it's come from, etc. There's a contradiction in that, because if it is triumphant and dominant, which seemingly it seems to be in how it is popularly understood today, as Hindutva nationalism as opposed to, the question is, how do you reconcile this contradiction then? If it is dominant, why does it need to look inwards?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So one of the things that these documents reveal is that the history of Hindu nationalism actually comprises of two very different strains of thought. So one strain of thought that goes back to people like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, then on from him on to Aurobindo, and from Aurobindo on to Savarkar and figures of that kind, is vigorously pragmatic or utilitarian, or very kind of concerned about things like security, the stability of the nation, what you need to do to catch up with the world that's left you behind. And there's a separate strain with figures that are now forgotten but were very influential at the time, people like Rajanarayan Bose, one of the leaders of the Brahmo Samaj in the 19th century. His student is Vivekananda, Vivekananda's student is Gandhi, and on the story goes. And those figures represent a different tradition in Hindu thinking about politics, and for them cultural values and cultural authenticity is deeply important. And what I one of the things I realized as I traced these two stories, which are actually quite distinct lines, figures like Savarkar or even Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, for example, says if Hindus need to eat beef or drink in order to be better warriors or better soldiers, if you need to drink when you're on the battlefield, then that's something you should do, even if it's contrary to the scriptures, because that's what the country needs you to do to survive and for the country to thrive and prosper and defeat invaders and things of that kind. And that's very different from what someone like Gandhi or what someone like Vivekananda or subsequently figures in the RSS might say, who are far more concerned about cultural purity or cultural authenticity. And so what I've found is that Hindu nationalism today, and particularly the Jan Sangh before and now the BJP, have never fully in their minds reconciled these two different sides. One side, the concern for security, the concern for economic progress, growth and development, calls for them to engage in modernization, to accept the world as it is, to accept foreign influences, to change, to seek their culture, change and adapt, and to engage wholeheartedly in modernization, industrialization, and so on. And there's a separate wing which the two haven't come together. The other wing searches for cultural purity to this day. So it worries about couples on Valentine's days and people sitting in parks and eating
things
beef.
that you would assume are not or should not be priorities in a nation that's on the path of modernization, a developing economy. Where are socio-cultural priorities, I suppose.
So those two things are heavily in conflict, and so my concern, or the point that I try and make in one of these papers that's forthcoming is, and in some of the presentations I've given, is that you have to make a choice. It is a hard choice that confronts Hindu nationalism, and Hindu nationalism as it is today cannot possibly continue in this fashion for the next 10, 15 years, because it'll have to decide, is it going to prioritize cultural purity, which will then come at the cost of economic development, modernization, integration with the global economy and global norms, or does it choose that path, which is the path of engaging with the world and entering into accepting foreign influences, allowing Indian culture to gradually change and modify by through interaction with others? If it chooses that path, then it's going to have to let go of some of these cultural
dogmas. Let me just
dogmas.
digress a little bit and go into sort of the aspect of religion that we're talking about, that's so linked to both aspects of both threads of nationalism that you're talking about. I mean, maybe things have changed now, but I remember growing up constantly hearing about how Hinduism is an all-encompassing religion. It's polytheistic, there's multiple gods and goddesses, multiple sects, and they've always found a way to coexist with each other. That's one view on Hinduism. That view would necessarily lend itself to what you say is this idea of Hindu nationalism that engages with the world or wants to engage and doesn't set itself into rigid boundaries.
That's right.
Where are we today?
I think we're in the midst of a debate, even amongst Hindu nationalists. I think it's going to have to, and when I mean a debate, I mean within the Hindu nationalist world. I think members of that community, people that who think hard about these things and think about what the future of Hinduism as a political institution, what its future is, they're going to have to resolve this dilemma. Which side are they going to choose, knowing that one way or the other, they're going to have to sacrifice something, prioritize something, and they really need to think hard about whether it's security, stability, and development that they want to sacrifice. Because I think that there's many reasons to think, looking at other countries that have chosen cultural authenticity over development, that they've suffered for that reason. And so it's a very hard choice for them to debate, but they have to, and they have to come to an answer.
So we're in a political climate that today is highly polarized into ideologically in terms of political left and right, so socialist versus capitalist, or right-wing hyper-nationalism versus secularism, as the case may be. And nobody seems to have been kept out of this. I mean, the boundaries of abuse seem limitless, for want of a better way of putting it. And social media, digital platforms have become a tool, a weapon, depending on which way you look at it, where armies, the troll armies are out there. This is constant discourse that you hear of. When we talk about patriotism and nationalism, when we talk about national versus anti-national, where do your ideas fit in? I mean, is it also reflective of a larger ignorance about the definitions of nationalism, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's been a debate that's been ongoing. If you look at Indian history and these different ideas that have been circulating and bouncing and colliding against each other since the early 19th century, there is an uncertainty about exactly what sort of national project we're going to aim for. And for a period of time, after independence, for about 30 or 40 years, some of those issues, those debates were contained. And now in some ways we're back to where we were in the period when, before 1947, the period between 1900 and 1947, when these debates were extremely vociferous, sharp-edged. Of course, what's changed is at that point the debate still had something of a genteel nature to it. And now we see the sort of rapid reactions, highly emotional, highly charged reactions online instantly, and as you said, waves of, or troll armies as they're called, kind of chasing without really reflecting on, thinking about distinctions,
what
subtleties.
Their agenda, what their aim is, and even in
and
that.
there's sort of this, onrush on. So someone says one thing, and that one thing is taken out of context and kind of attacked mercilessly. So I think we've got it's a problem of public discourse that when we talk about these ideas, what ought to be a fair, frank, kind of subtle, careful analysis. Reasonable, honorable people can disagree about what they, this happens all the time in the United States or in Germany or in England. People disagree about what the national project is. Germany, for instance, is in the midst of a large debate about whether immigrants can or can't be accepted. What does it mean to be German? Is it a racial concept? Is it an ethnic concept? Do you have to know German? So it's completely reasonable for countries to have these kinds of discussions, but it's the way in which you undertake the discussion, the tone and tenor of public debate, respect for one's opinions and contrary points of views, looking for grounds where you can agree, understanding where you disagree. That requires something very different from what we are seeing. What we are seeing is venom and aggression, and that is not at all conducive to understanding any of these issues or resolving them.
Okay, so one of the interesting things as a student of political science one always learned, when you talked about nationalism, there were not just with Hindu nationalism as you've identified two strains, but the broader concepts of nationalism. One was, as you say, the Germans are wondering whether it's about race or ethnicity or just geographical boundaries that define every community living within them, or whether it's an identity-driven thing. Today, across the world, I mean, India is also an example of when we look at xenophobia or right-wing movements or hyper-nationalism across the world, we're looking at this trend where as people interact with the larger universe, they're also getting more inward, and identity is becoming parochial in a way that perhaps it wasn't even 20 years ago.
This is the problem of our age. It's the unexpected problem of our age. There's a famous one of the great political thinkers of the 20th century was an English philosopher called Isaiah Berlin, and he had this essay that he wrote near the end of the Cold War called The Bent Twig, which came out in Foreign Affairs, and I encourage people to read it. And what this essay basically said was that identity, and particularly nationalism, was like a bent twig. You would bend it and you would hope that it would break and go away, and it would eventually, one way or the other, it would snap back. And it was this argument about the recurrence and these cycles in history where concerns about identity and concerns about belonging and authenticity keep reappearing. Every century we see some version of this. In the past century we saw a couple of versions of this that were extremely destructive. And it speaks to something about, I think, the human condition, that in our search and our quest for meaning, in our way to make sense of our lives and of our collective lives, we fixate on identity as one of the ways in which we are going to relieve this anxiety that we have and expel this energy that we have, this sense of loss, this sense of you find belonging, so you feel you have a mission, a project, it gives your life meaning. And the therapy for that is history, is understanding that these things, you're not the first, this is not the first time. And that's what we, in this moment, we lack.
Do you think that people are just comfortable or happy to ignore history? One of the liberal arguments right now is that there is no respect for history in today's climate. Social media or the internet has made information instant, attention spans have gotten shorter, the time to reflect is almost zero, and context is often devoid of comment, and vice versa. Comment is devoid of context, whichever we want to look at it. Is that fueling this idea that, it's all right, we just need to be in this moment, whatever happened before, in the past, we're, this is rebirth from now.
Yeah, I think that is, so we have these, we have figures who will look at a particular leader or a particular moment.
And we're having these political comments made across, whether it's draining the swamp in Washington or what's happening in parts of Europe, what even the Indian Prime Minister from time to time will say, or Indian political leaders will say about, what happened for 70 years and what's happening today, cleaning up the system, etc. It negates history.
Yeah, I mean, there's the hope of sort of wiping the slate clean, that we're going to have a fresh start. None of the errors, the mistakes, the human shortcomings, the foibles of the past, that those are going to occur now. We're going to start afresh. And even a basic awareness of the patterns of history over time, just of the various debates, even if we were to talk only about India, but this is particularly true of the US.
Yeah.
The frequency with which US has attacked immigrants, for instance, and how it's thought about its own nation, whether it was, most people now have forgotten, for example, that the US legally excluded Asiatics from entering the United States. Then after it allowed them to enter, primarily because of Japan's rise, it refused to allow them to become citizens.
It refused to allow them to marry.
Yes, amongst other things.
Yeah.
So it's, and then before that, before the Asiatics, so to speak, it was, the Irish. Before them it was people from Eastern Europe and so on. So it's, or Italians. So it is the case that we have to always worry about these moments in history which keep recurring, as I was saying earlier, where we go back to this desire for purity, for wiping away what looked like annoying differences, and that leads to this quest for this sort of ideal leader who's going to come, clean everything up. It's all going to be perfect. We will all lead better lives as soon as we get rid of these people that make our lives difficult. And you see it in culture after culture, country after country, decade or century after century. And an awareness of history, an awareness of our own weaknesses. I mean, that's the essence of liberal education.
Yeah.
Liberal education requires you to understand human shortcoming. That's the essence of liberal education, that you understand that we are all perennially in search for the truth, and very few people have it, if any. And it's a tolerance of difference and a tolerance of different points of views. And that's, it's sad to say that the US is probably one of the places where that's now most in peril. And elsewhere too.
And tolerance is shrinking, as you said, elsewhere too, across the world. So, Rahul, Sagar, tell me something. You part of what you're doing in your writings and research is also you're working on a book on India's future.
That's
and
right.
Where India is in the world at this point in time, how it should position itself as a global player. Your research on Hindu nationalism, how does that tie in with this work that you're doing?
Sure. I think the fundamental question that Indians have been asking themselves, the big overarching question since the middle of the 19th century, and it continues to this day, is literally this: are we to learn from the world, or are we going to teach the world something? So the sets of persons who thought we have something to learn from the world thought that there was something deficient, or there was a shortcoming in the way we'd organized our political system, our social life, our cultural and economic life. That's the reason we'd been left behind. It was not simply colonialism, but we had in fact been colonized because we had failed to adapt. And that we needed to look at the world around us to learn, as we today say in management speak, best practices. Right? We need to reach widely, whether it's to how we develop our institutions, how we pursue education, and so on. That's what we need to do. And there was another set of people. I wouldn't use the term reactionary or something like that. I don't think that's what they were doing. But they felt a great deal of sort of indigenous pride, that we were once immense and great. We have a civilization that is rightly being praised and is valuable, and that if we return to that civilization, we will accomplish greatness. So we need to return to our roots. We need to stay true to who we are. That will make us great, not necessarily learning from others. In fact, we have to teach other people. We know things that they don't know. So the great figures, figures like Vivekananda and indeed Gandhi, held to this view that it's India that will that has true civilization, and it's India's civilization that needs to go abroad, which is to teach other people how to be tolerant, pluralistic, and so on. And that group, that worldview, ranges against the ones who think that there's a lot that we in fact need to learn. And so what this book talks about is, as I was saying at the beginning of our conversation, I think Hindu nationalists confront this question, this dilemma today. Are they to believe? Should they think that they have all the answers, that their way of life and the things that they value are in fact the only truly valuable things, or should they allow others to explore, to experiment, and loosen the grip, to be less rigid, to allow a diversity of views and particularly of lifestyles to appear?
And in terms of specific examples that you can think of where India has tried to place its cultural, civilizational worldview as an aspect of foreign policy, for example, versus where you've had the more hard approaches. I mean, can you give us specific examples of what you think?
Right. I mean, so one of these, you get these moments where it's whether it's taking yoga abroad, or whether
Yes.
it's having religious figures go and speak overseas, or at least presenting their points of views.
I mean, the UN has International Yoga Day now. They
Right.
declared that. Right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
right. And so there are. I wouldn't want to say that's that it's not useful or not valuable to project one's culture, and especially these aspects of it that deal with kind of spiritual truth or the quest for spiritual satisfaction. Those are useful things to show the world, and it gives you what's called sort of soft power. It gives you the opportunity to sort of gain supporters or adherents. But if that becomes the only or the substantial part of your efforts, then you're taking your eye off many of the other more concrete things that need to be accomplished. So the sort of feel-good export of culture is different from thinking kind of in a more rigorous way about what India's place is going to be, and being, so if what you're exporting is stories about couples being lynched or individuals being lynched or beef bans and things of that kind, any other work that you're doing as cultural diplomacy and so on is being completely undermined by those sorts of actions.
Well, that's often a charge that the government makes against the media, that the media doesn't focus on anything else but all this. But that's the charge.
Right.
That's put forward. The counter charge is, but this is happening and it shouldn't happen. Even one lynching is one too many.
Yeah.
So it does go out.
Yes, I mean, I think so. That's this goes back to, Hindu nationalists have to make a decision that where do they stand on some of these issues? Are they willing to, on the one hand, if they're pursuing the sort of cultural diplomacy that talks about yoga and the Deen Dayal Upadhyay's famous doctrine, integral humanism, you care for the whole human being, you worry about their well-being in all aspects. How do you reconcile that with continuing poverty? How do you reconcile that with immense amounts of environmental damage and pollution? How do you reconcile that with a complete failure to really deal with the security of women and children? So if you can't accomplish those things, you completely undermine any hope you have of exporting your culture as something that people should aspire to, or that they should admire or support. And so I think there's some. This is what I mean, that there's a contradiction between what's said on the one hand and what's happening on the other. And if you want to reconcile those two things, it requires much more than feel-good statements. You need concrete action, without which many of these other goals won't ever be realized.
So finally, coming back to a point you had made earlier about how things happen in cycles as well. We're going into an aggressive political campaign, 6 assembly elections in 2018, a general election in the first half of 2019. What is your advice?
Well, my advice is not going to be followed, that's for sure. My advice is that we need to turn from the use of identity, which I think has been a source of great angst for many years, the use of identity, to talking about policy, to caring about outcomes and people's lives and their actual well-being and what's actually delivered and done for them, rather than talking about promises. And it's this moving away from promises and identity towards delivering outcomes. That's what I would like the conversation to be about.
But we're in the cycle.
I fear that we're neither in the United States, nor in India, nor in parts of Europe are we at this moment where that's what people want to talk about. Instead, unfortunately, we seem to be at this moment returning once again to this moment in history where scapegoating, aggression, anxiety, imaginary or real fears seem to be what dominate, rather than looking for constructive, positive solutions. And it's a difficult few years ahead for across
so one
the world.
has to consciously also fight against these pulls and pressures from identity-based nationalism or the sort of imposition of it from the state.
And particularly narrow. I mean, we will all, concerns about identity, as I was saying in the beginning, are a part of our life. We look for identity to provide us with meaning. So it isn't the case that, identity politics or worrying about identity is entirely wrong.
That,
we don't want to, we will never lose that. But there's versions of it that are narrow and exclusionary and violent, and there are versions of it that it doesn't have to always be composite, it doesn't always have to be liberal and loving, but there's a difference.
It could be inclusive.
It could
tolerant.
It could at least allow for
dissent.
In a
democracy.
Well, dissent, but also that it for reason, that you require evidence, that claims be made on the basis of thought and fact and careful evaluation rather than hurling abuse and charges around.
Well, I think that's sound advice, Rahul Sagar. Thanks very much. That make claims on the basis of fact and reason, and let that do the talking, and allow space for reasonable dissent, reasonable conversation and debate. And I think it's very important to reclaim that from the kind of aggression and impoliteness, for want of a better word, that we see in our public spaces and in public discourse. Thanks very much, Rahul Sagar, for speaking to Wide Angle.
Thanks for having me.